thought I would begin and end with quotes from Nigel Vinson. The first one is, "Capitalism works best when it enables, through ownership, citizens to have a stake in the nation. It fails when it adulates the making of money without a social or moral purpose." So think about that last phrase, the making of money without a social or moral purpose. Fine, what am I going to talk about? Well, Tom kindly gave a plug for the book. I didn't bring a pile to give away on the table because, frankly, it's sold so few copies I just can't afford to give them away. But there it is, The Good, the Bad and the Greedy, Why We've Lost Faith in Capitalism. This whole segment is called Faith in Markets, ? But you may be thinking, you all being free market advocates here, what on earth does he mean, why we've lost faith in capitalism? I mean, how many ways can you challenge that as a title? First of all, it assumes we have lost faith in capitalism. Secondly, who's we? Third, what does he mean by faith? And fourth, sort of slightly easier to tackle, what does he mean by capitalism? And does he, the author, Martin, mean he himself has lost faith in capitalism? So let me just run through those for a start. Who do I mean by we? Well, what my book was about was largely about British public attitudes. It goes wider. You can say there are elements of European public attitudes that are hostile or suspicious towards what they would call Anglo-Saxon capitalism. There are elements of US public opinion that hates Wall Street, is suspicious of big corporations, is especially suspicious of big tech and its sinister power over data and AI and all of that. But whereas the Americans on the whole love capitalism, the point I want to make to you is the Brits on the whole don't love it, are suspicious of it, and have held that view for a very long time. And what has then happened is that capitalism has embarrassed itself over and over again in modern times, even though, to answer the question, have I personally lost faith in capitalism? No, I haven't. I believe, I write every week in this tone, and what this book says is that I think capitalism is the most powerful engine of prosperity and human progress ever invented, but it needs to be aware of its flaws and it needs to reform itself, correct itself from time to time. What am I talking about? I said I'd be a bit more precise when I talk about capitalism. I want to make a small distinction, if I may, between capitalism and entrepreneurship. So I'm rather talking about big corporate capitalism, public markets, the deployment at large scale of other people's capital into growing and large businesses. So I would include private equity, I include most financial markets in this, and I include all large public corporations. I exclude from the sort of critical part of the analysis the entrepreneur-led, relatively small, high-growth, innovative, disruptive entrepreneur business, which I unequivocally admire. I run a competition for the Spectator called the Economic Innovator of the Year Awards, which is about to announce this year's winners. We have 267 entries. I met 50 of them. I absolutely love doing that, and I have, as I say, unmixed admiration for the bold, innovative, disruptive, risk-taking entrepreneur. I have less admiration for the bad chief executive of the large corporation that disgraces itself. So that's where I'm heading on the subject of what is capitalism. What I mean by faith? Well, I differ here. My two fellow speakers are both speaking from a religious point of view. We can take faith as meaning simply complete trust or confidence in someone or something. That's rather what I meant in the title of the book. But it can also, obviously enough, mean strong belief in the doctrines of a religion based on spiritual conviction. And I'm going to divert a little bit to talk about religion and British capitalism in order to dovetail with my fellow speakers. So, the who's we, as I say, is essentially British public opinion over quite a long period of time. And there isn't enough space in this program to go through the entire history from the pre-industrial age onwards. But where I might start is in pre-industrial capitalism, the rather frankly exploitative, sometimes brutal activity of the East India Company, that kind of thing. The exponents of that very early form of capitalism genuinely believed they were doing God's work. That extremely hard to defend position. Now, I happen to be wearing, you might have been wondering why I'm wearing a fancy tie like that. That is the tie of something called the Company of Merchant Adventurers of the City of York, of which I happen to be this year's governor. So on Saturday night I was robed up, sitting on a throne, presiding over a banquet of 180 modern, business folk, entrepreneurs of the Yorkshire region. And we pray, whenever we have a service, we pray our own prayer. It's not, the company is founded in 1357. I think this prayer is probably 18th century. And we pray, make us to be true merchant adventurers, bold travellers into thy world of spirit, and finding there great treasure to bring it back and enrich man's life on earth. So that is giving, as it were, a religious or religiose tone to the activity of people who were cloth merchants across the North Sea to the Baltic in those pre-industrial days. But it's clear they believed that what they were doing was consonant with what God would want them to do. Well, let's move forward to the Industrial Revolution and ask, did it go with the grain of British popular religious expression or go against it? Do the two things connect at all? We think of the satanic mills, Manchester's cotton mills, the railway boom despoiling the countryside, lots of scams and stock market scandals associated with that and so on, the great shipbuilding and engineering ventures, Birmingham's metal and jewellery shops. Well, where was religion in all of that? Not very present, actually. If you had to identify any religious strands of industrial development in this country, it would be Quakerism in banking, breweries, and chocolate. Chocolate and breweries, chocolate particularly could have been imported from places where slaves were working. Both beer and chocolate, quite bad for the consumer, if consumed to excess. But the banking is just banking. But anyway, the Quakers were good at all of those things. Was it a religiously driven thing, or was it simply a kind of community thing? Tight-knit communities, cousinage, which gave them networks, mutual trust with other Quakers, prudence and restraint in their beliefs, absence of liturgy or ritual to get in the way of daily business and so on. And they were just quite cautious, prudent, quiet people who got on with their business very successfully. And they were a closed sect, just as we might divert to talk about the Jewish community in the garment trade in London and so on. In Birmingham, in the metal bashing industries, a lot of the prominent families were Unitarians. That's a particular low church sect. It was simply the fact that the Chamberlain family, the Kenrick family, these leading families, all went to church together in that particular church. So again, cousinage and networks may be more important than theology, if you see what I mean. If we ask what the mainstream Church of England was doing at that time, the parish churches, cathedrals, the deans, the Trollopian archdeacons, I'm going to generalise wildly and say they probably weren't interested in capitalism at all. They were much more closely attached to the old England of a landed gentry, of the aristocratic patron of the parish, the posh people who sat in their pews and the poor people sat at the back, the old hierarchical English society fitted neatly with the old Church of England, and the learned clergy belonged to an elite which also included judges, colonial officials, military officers, and so on, but almost never included up-and-coming self-made business leaders who were looked down upon by that society. Trade was vulgar. Early company organisations rather tended to mirror great landed estates, so you have great lords, and then you have the agent and the man of business, who is, below the salt and all of that. So I think the Church of England was not going along with the new wave of industry. Then cultural change. So Industrial Revolution, railway mania, cotton mills, all of that, up to the Great Exhibition of 1851, Prince Albert, sort of reverence for machinery, for physical progress. But that was a kind of a zenith. Stephenson, the great railway engineer, died in 1848, Brunel in 1859. Around that time, public mood shifted. They weren't interested in great industrial progress. They revered a sort of pastoralism, the handicrafts of, the arts and crafts movement, Pugin's architecture, the rise of high Anglicanism in the church. The heroes were Livingstone and Stanley, explorers, General Gordon of Khartoum, but they were not business people. So whereas the Americans began to revere their, great emergent tycoons, and so did the Germans, let's say, we didn't. We quite liked, well, I don't know if we liked them, but we gave a certain deference to bankers who became so rich that they joined the aristocracy, but no one made a fuss about John Pender, who laid the first transatlantic cable, or John Boyd Dunlop of the pneumatic tyre, or William Knox Darcy, one of the great pioneers of the oil industry. There are no statues to these people at all. And after World War I, there was a famous phrase, I think it was Baldwin's, about hard-faced men who did well in the war. J.B. Priestley wrote about the black-moustached, glossy gentleman from the city of London exploiting the maidens of the working classes. This boss class in a society completely riven by class distinction was never respected as the old landowning class was. Then came the rise of the unions, the disappointment of men returning from the war and not finding good jobs, the general strike, the great crash, all of those things which reinforced a kind of anti-business cultural sentiment. And after World War II, more of the same, really. The great tycoons of the 1950s, in property and retail mostly, were mostly Jewish, and what they encountered was a popular anti-Semitism, a tendency to brand them as spivs and asset strippers. And if you want to check this out as a theory, look at any evidence from popular culture, the theatre, the cinema, the television. See if you can find a single positive role model from the world of business and entrepreneurship. I always quote the example of Coronation Street, which I used to watch religiously. It's gone a bit mad now, I don't bother. But the only manufacturing business ever featured was a knicker factory called Underworld, owned by a sort of villainous man. Do you know what I mean? And in later times, the adversarial style of Dragon's Den and The Apprentice on television, reinforcing a caricature of the ugly, aggressive boss shouting at the junior and so on. Well, the 80s, things changed. We had Thatcherism. We had a wave of policy change designed to encourage people's capitalism, popular capitalism. We had the great privatisation issues of British Telecom and especially British Gas. The Tell Sid campaign is an iconic 1980s thing. It attracted more than 4 million public applications for shares in British Gas. The right to buy, now a very controversial thing for council houses that were bought but not replaced in the social housing stock. The invention of personal pensions, the encouragement of people to go to self-employment and become, essentially, entirely independent operators. Perhaps self-employed, but with assets that consisted of a house and a portfolio of shares and a personal pension, and they were not ever going to be dependent on welfare. And frankly, there was a certain gerrymandering in that. They were likely to vote Tory for the rest of their lives. But anyway, the objective was, I think, high-minded and good on the part of the Thatcherite thinkers of the time. But what did it lead to? That's the problem. Where did capitalism go after that sort of rather golden phase of the mid-1980s? It produced this new breed known as fat cats. It produced a continuous 30-plus year argument about what is a fair rate of pay for a chief executive. It confused the entrepreneur business builder who deserves to be richly rewarded with the time-serving 3 to 5 year chief executive who inherits a pretty good business, may leave it as good as he found it, may leave it worse off, but collects millions and millions on the way through. And the difference between average pay and chief executive pay multiplied first from 20 times in the 70s, which was pretty well Soviet level, to 50 times by the end of the 20th century, to 100, 120, 150 times today. And no one can produce a rational justification of that other than it's the market and that's what they pay in America and that's sometimes what they pay in the city, so why shouldn't every other, So that has caused a lot of friction and irritation. Then a series of financial scandals, mis-selling of personal pensions. Many, many people who were persuaded by personal pensions would have been far better to stay in the company pension schemes from which they removed themselves because they were sold these things by the Pru and others. Mis-selling of other stuff, personal, what's it called, PPI, a form of insurance attached to bank loans to help you pay it off, but hidden in the small print with layers of fees, lots of people sued. Payday lending, another splurge. You name it, diesel cars, all these things that the lawyers and ambulance chasers advertise to get you to sign up to, and they'll get you your money back. Coinciding with the rise of a feature of human nature we probably weren't expecting, which is the rise of victimhood. So everybody's now a victim of this stuff. The idea of caveat emptor, that you should have read the small print in the first place, disappeared completely. The idea that if you lied to get a fantastically expensive payday loan to go on holiday, and they then charge you thousands of % on the loan because you can't pay it back, you're a victim. We could debate that and its Christian aspects, but victimhood played against misbehavior in the financial world. Then the 2008 crisis, in which the wealthy did better than the poor, as we know, and so it got worse. Now, it's not all in the financial sector. A lot of bribery and corruption to be found in the aerospace industry, in the pharmaceutical industry. Far too much misbehavior in the area of capitalism I described, that is to say financial markets and big corporations. And then, in recent times, the issue of multinational tax avoidance, it was referred to earlier today. It's not so much that companies, big corporations, are entitled to put their business in the place with the lowest tax, so you might well go and build a factory in Ireland or a depot in Ireland because it's lower tax. It's the fact that they put their Amazon books its business in the UK, a UK product fulfilled from a UK warehouse to a UK customer could be booked through Liechtenstein in order to take a tax advantage. Starbucks, every cup of coffee, there's a royalty paid to Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, wherever it is, for the use of the Starbucks logo. That is simply very sophisticated tax avoidance, and they do not pay the sufficiency of tax that they should pay, given that they operate in a particular place with staff educated in our system, with roads and service, you know the arguments. Anyway, that too has upset popular opinion. So popular opinion started off not trusting capitalism, and capitalism has made that worse in recent times. It remains the case that capitalism is a great engine of prosperity. It behaved rather well, though it had to be propped up a bit by governments, but it did behave well, the pharmaceutical industry, during COVID. AstraZeneca produced vast billions of COVID inoculations at a no-profit basis. Got no thanks particularly for that, but other companies in that field did remarkable things to help save us all from COVID in that crisis. Some other capitalists exploited the PPE market. We know that. They're the ones that get the publicity. The big corporations who really did wonderful work didn't. Where do we get to from there, from now? After COVID, I would say attention is really on big tech. Maybe we can discuss that in the questions. I should come to a point in a couple of minutes, I think, to keep to my half hour. I think now, where is the loss of faith in capitalism? It's that in quasi-religious terms, the world has developed a faith in the power of the internet, of the device in their hand, the sort of limitless source of knowledge and mischief and games and fun and wicked things and, sports betting and porn and all of that stuff. It's all in this device in your hand. It's extraordinarily powerful. We do not understand the technology, but what we do know is somewhere behind it are Zuckerberg and Musk and these multi-billionaires with weird attitudes. They want to live on man-made, tax-free islands. They want to go to Mars. They're not really true Democrats. They're extreme elitists. Some of them believe in eugenics. They're weird people. And we don't know what they're doing with our data. We don't know what they're going to do next with artificial intelligence. So I think the suspicion towards big capital is now more global, and it's particularly to do with big tech. And if I'm drawing it back to religion, I think it's perhaps that organized religion in the old sense has been rather replaced by a new religion of faith in technology, which also carries with it fear of what's behind the technology. So let's come to that in the questions too. So that's my thesis for you. We never had in this country great faith in capitalism. There was always a cultural suspicion, a looking down upon trade, a longing for a sort of Arcadian pre-industrial England and so on, and that through the 20th century was exaggerated, built up, and then in the modern era of wildly overexpanded financial markets, misbehavior, obvious greed at the executive level, and so on, short-termism, all of these things, perversions of capitalism, if you like. The core of capitalism goes on, does great work for the world, but so much has gone bad around the edges of it, and that's why we've lost faith in capitalism. But let me finish, as I said I would, with a second quote from Nigel Vincent. I think it's very appropriate because it's part of his speech for the opening of this very building. Free market capitalism is not perfect. Casino capitalism is a damaging aberration. Markets need to be conducted within a strong social and moral ethos and a well-regulated framework. They then produce widespread wealth, which makes a better world. By that, I do not mean making money out of money. I mean the creation of wealth through worthwhile activities in a free society. And as I wrote in the Spectator that week, I couldn't agree more. Carve those words in stone. I don't know whether you ever have one, but there's still time to carve them in stone. Anyway, thank you. I hope that's provocative enough for the after-lunch session.